Have you ever wondered why you seem to feel everything, not just your own emotions, but the energy in a room, the subtle shifts in someone's tone, the lies wrapped in pretty words? If you've ever felt like your heart is a frequency tuned to emotional truth, then no, you're not too sensitive. You're a super empath, and that's not a burden. It's a gift, especially when you wake up from the emotional fog of being with someone avoidant. I'm Jim Rohn, and today I want to walk with you into something deeper. Not a rant, not a revenge tale, but a reckoning, a return to self-respect. We're going to break down exactly what happens when someone who was born to heal decides they're done carrying other people's pain. This isn't loud, this isn't petty, this is power quiet, rooted unshakable power. You see, avoidants thrive on chaos. They feed on the emotional push-pull, the mixed signals, the vanishing acts, the empty promises. They believe the empath will always stay lost in the loop, apologizing, overgiving, questioning themselves. But what they never expect is this: the moment the empath stops playing. The moment they start seeing the patterns. The moment they stop blaming themselves and start setting boundaries, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. And when those boundaries are paired with peace, it rattles the avoidant to their core. Because you can't manipulate someone who's no longer confused. You can't destabilize someone who sees through your game. That's when the super empath breaks the cycle, not with retaliation, but with detachment. Not with accusations, but with silence. So if you've ever felt like you loved too hard, gave too much, hoped too long, this one's for you. To remind you that you were never broken. You were powerful all along. And when you stop leaking your emotional gold to people who don't value it, you don't just break the pattern, you redefine your entire reality. If this resonates with you, stay with me until the end of the video, because by the time we're done, you won't look back on that relationship with regret. You'll look back with clarity. And if this message lands for you, make sure to hit subscribe so we can keep growing this space for healing self-worth and emotional mastery. A super empath is not the overly sensitive person the world makes them out to be. They are individuals gifted with razor-sharp emotional intelligence, able to detect what's unsaid, what's hidden between lines, what lingers in the silence. To them, a dishonest sentence rings like a siren. A fake smile feels like a wall being built. They don't just feel emotions, they absorb them. They merge with them. And for a long time, they believed that made them too much. But in truth, it was never a flaw. It was a gift, an internal compass helping them navigate the emotional terrain of others with remarkable clarity. But what happens when that deep-feeling individual meets someone avoidant? Someone who survives by burying emotions, dodging vulnerability, and maintaining control through distance and silence. The connection may feel fated, but it's a spiritual test. The avoidant is drawn to the warmth and depth of the super empath, like a parched soul discovering a wellspring. But instead of cherishing it, they fear it. Because the closer they get, the more they're forced to confront the emotions they've suppressed for a lifetime. In the early stages, the empath gets destabilized. They feel the chill of distance, the sting of silence, the chaos of mixed signals, all while trying to fix what feels broken. They misinterpret chaos for depth. Love becomes a project. And so the cycle begins. One withdraws, the other chases. One manipulates with ambiguity, the other internalizes blame. The empath bends over backward to understand, to forgive, to hold on. But eventually, the super empath awakens. A shift happens. They ask, why am I always the emotional caretaker? Why do I keep giving without return? Why is my kindness taken for granted? And when they realize I wasn't made to be drained, everything begins to change. They don't stop being sensitive, they become sovereign. They pair their compassion with self-respect. And that's when the entire dynamic flips. They stop bending to accommodate discomfort. They set boundaries without guilt. They choose presence over pursuit. This isn't easy. It requires them to go inward to heal the child who thought love must be earned through sacrifice. But something beautiful happens when they start loving themselves the way they once loved others. They stop being the victim. They become the author of the story. The avoidant, once in control through ambiguity, starts to lose their grip. Not because the empath fights back, but because they opt out. They no longer need to be understood. They stop chasing validation. They choose themselves not with a scream, but with a calm, deliberate silence. A silence born from dignity, rooted in power, saying simply, I deserve more than this. Deserve. When a super empath steps out of the role of savior, they begin to see relationships not through the lens of longing, but through the lens of clarity. And from that clarity, they often recognize one of the most common patterns, the dynamic between the empath and the avoidant. Not every avoidant is manipulative or malicious, but the truth is they respond to intimacy in a way that's completely foreign to the empath. For the empath, deep emotional connection is lifeblood. But for the avoidant, that closeness triggers a fear response. It activates a deep internal alarm, the fear of losing control, the fear of being engulfed, the fear of confronting old emotional wounds. So as the empath leans in, the avoidant pulls back. When one side reaches out with emotional vulnerability, the other responds with silence, defensiveness, or subtle withdrawal. It's not because they don't care, but because their nervous system is wired to perceive closeness as danger. They're not trying to hurt the empath, they're trying to protect themselves. And if the empath doesn't understand this, they'll internalize the pushback as rejection. They'll believe they're too much, too needy, or too emotional. Eventually, the relationship becomes a loop. One person overfunctions to keep the connection alive. The other underfunctions to keep the distance intact. And the saddest part, both are hurting. The empath feels perpetually dismissed. The avoidant feels perpetually intruded upon. But both are trying to protect something. The empath, their sense of love and meaning. The avoidant, their sense of autonomy and safety. And here's the pivot point. If the empath never wakes up, they'll continue orbiting around the avoidant like a moon around a planet, constantly shrinking themselves over, eroding their own boundaries just to maintain a bond that costs them their peace. But when the super empath finally understands that their worth isn't dependent on making someone else feel comfortable, they begin to awaken. They stop being afraid of being too much. They start setting boundaries not out of spite, but out of self-respect. They begin to say, "That hurts me," not to accuse, but to honor their truth. This awakening doesn't immediately change the avoidant, but it completely rewires the relationship dynamic. The empath stops being led by the fear of disconnection. They stop trying to earn love. They stop bending to fit into someone else's emotional limitations. They choose clarity over confusion, truth over temporary comfort. And from that space where self-respect lives, where boundaries are sacred, where inner strength is no longer abandoned, they walk away from old roles, not in anger, but in wisdom. Because they know no relationship can thrive if only one person is doing the emotional labor. The real turning point doesn't come from anger. It doesn't arise from resentment or a desire to punish. The real shift happens when the super empath realizes no one is worth loving so much that you have to abandon yourself just to hold on to them. That is the moment of awakening when they stop carrying the emotional burdens of others, stop assigning themselves the responsibility of healing someone by sacrificing their own boundaries and sense of worth. They begin to reflect on the times they said yes when they wanted to say no, the times they stayed silent to preserve a false peace, the times they told themselves, "I can handle just a little more," and finally understand that's not love, that's self-abandonment. This awakening is not loud. It doesn't look like a dramatic rebellion. It's quiet but profound, like a door inside slowly creaking open and light pouring in. The super empath starts setting boundaries, not to control, not to push others away, but to protect their inner space, the part of themselves they've neglected for far too long. They realize that kindness should never be assumed as default. That deep sensitivity does not mean endless tolerance, forgiveness, or silence. And most importantly, they realize no one has the right to define their worth except themselves. At this point, they no longer react out of habit. They no longer text out of panic, no longer over-explain to be understood, no longer prolong conversations with someone who has repeatedly chosen absence. They begin to choose intentional silence. They learn to step back, not out of fear, but because they're strong enough not to chase. They become selective with their energy, intentional about who gets access to their heart. And this is the moment of transformation, when the super empath steps out of the role of the healer. They don't become cold, they become clear. They don't close their heart, but they stop offering it unconditionally. They protect themselves as something sacred. And that is what shifts the entire dynamic between them and the avoidant. Because the avoidant used to someone who emotionally carried things for them, now feels the space. No more reactions. No more rescuing. No more apologizing on their behalf or smoothing things over. The avoidant is now forced to sit with the feelings they've long avoided. There's no one left to buffer it, no one to absorb the fallout. And this intentional silence, it's not punishment. It's a declaration in action: I deserve full presence too. And I won't push myself aside just so someone else can stay comfortable. What changes the dynamic isn't anger, it's calm. When a super empath steps out of emotional chaos and begins to embody stillness, the avoidant starts to feel a shift. The cycle of arguments, reconciliation, doubt, hope is gone. No more long texts trying to explain, no more over-efforting to be understood. No more familiar presence, always ready to listen, forgive and reshape themselves just to keep the relationship afloat. And it's the absence of reaction that disorients the avoidant, not because they're being attacked, but because the familiar dynamic no longer exists. That calm becomes a mirror. When the empath no longer responds out of habit, no longer rushes to ease tension, no longer rescues someone else's emotional state, no longer apologizes for someone else's silence, the avoidant is forced to face what they've been avoiding all along themselves. The empty spaces begin to echo because no one is filling the room with empathy, reassurance, or unconditional giving anymore. The avoidant begins to feel what they once denied. The distance they created doesn't protect them, it isolates them. And now there's no one left to blame. Here, the empath doesn't need to speak loudly to be powerful. It's in the not explaining, the not justifying, the no longer needing to convince that is the loudest statement: I know my worth. I don't need to earn love. This inner peace doesn't come from controlling others, it comes from mastering oneself. And once that shift happens, the empath stops reacting to every contradiction, stops getting pulled into subtle power games. They see clearly now, love should never cost you yourself. To the avoidant, this feels like an emotional earthquake. They're used to others filling the gap for them emotionally and energetically. They don't know how to navigate someone who no longer fuels the old dynamic. And when the empath holds their calm, it's not coldness, it's clarity. It silently delivers a message: I'm not here to be consumed, I'm not willing to give away my wholeness just to keep a connection. And that message, unspoken, non-reactive, is what shatters the old balance. When the empath shifts from absorbing to observing, they don't just change their relationship with the avoidant, they change their entire emotional ecosystem. They learn to sit with uncertainty without filling it with action. They learn to let others take responsibility for their own feelings. They stop letting someone else's silence define their worth. And the strange thing is, the more still they become, the stronger they feel. No raised voice, no explanation, just clarity. And here lies the real turning point. The empath doesn't need to win. They don't need the avoidant to admit to change or to apologize. They simply need to return to themselves. They choose peace over chaos, self-worth over scraps of acceptance. And from that place, the power dynamic dissolves not through confrontation, but because the avoidant has nothing left to control. And then something begins to happen quietly, but with unshakable strength. The so-called mirror effect. It's not revenge. The super empath doesn't suddenly switch roles to become the one who wounds. They don't retaliate. They reflect. This is someone who used to shrink to keep the peace, who used to carry the emotional weight of the relationship, who used to dim their own intuition for the sake of closeness. Now standing tall, not loud, not angry, just clear. They observe with unshaken eyes, with silence that no longer waits for a response, with the grounded energy of someone who's simply no longer willing to compromise with chaos. And that, more than any confrontation, becomes the mirror the avoidant has no choice but to face. The mirror doesn't wound, it exposes. It reveals the patterns that have played out on loop. It shows how they pull away, not because they don't care, but because intimacy feels threatening. It shows how control is not love, it's protection. It shows how the silent treatment was never peace, but a weapon. And for the first time, there's no reaction. No one rushing in to soothe them. No one apologizing for being too emotional. No one filling the gap with unconditional empathy. And in that stillness, the avoidant, if they have the courage, may finally turn inward. There's no one left to blame, no one left to absorb the discomfort, just them, face to face with the very emotions they've spent years avoiding: the fear of connection, the dread of losing control, and the unresolved pain they never gave language to. Meanwhile, the empath does nothing, and yet everything. They don't rescue. They don't explain. They simply choose themselves. They pull back the unconditional presence. They hold their boundary not as a punishment, but as protection. And most of all, they're not doing it to change the other person, they're doing it so they don't abandon themselves again. That's the difference. A person who reflects doesn't seek power. They seek clarity. They say, I'm not here to be consumed. They say love shouldn't shrink me. They say closeness should not require chasing. And in that clarity, even the avoidant, whether they deny it or flee, cannot help but feel the shift. Some avoidants will retreat further. They'll shut down harder, go colder, maybe even lash out, not because they hate the empath, but because they hate the mirror. It shows them parts of themselves they're not ready to hold. But for those who are willing, those with enough self-awareness, this mirror can be a beginning. A quiet invitation to look again. Not through blame, not through control, but through honest reckoning. They may begin to see that distance doesn't bring safety, that control doesn't create intimacy, that avoidance doesn't protect them, it only prolongs their loneliness. And as the empath keeps holding their ground, not fixing, not fighting, not fleeing, they're giving themselves something sacred, emotional sovereignty. And maybe, just maybe, they're also giving the avoidant a chance not to return, but to awaken. The inner freedom of the super empath isn't a punishment, it's a return, a sacred return to the self, after years of being in relationships where they had to dim their light to keep the peace, where kindness was mistaken for obligation and compassion became a fuel supply for others with little reciprocity. When the super empath begins to prioritize their own mental and emotional safety, it's not because they've grown cold. Quite the opposite. It's the highest act of love, because true love never demands self-erasure. To the avoidant, this shift can feel destabilizing. The empath is no longer reacting, no longer chasing validation, no longer playing their part in the old emotional loop. They don't need to be understood to feel worthy anymore. They don't see being ignored as a cry for help, but as a reflection of readiness or the lack thereof. And when they truly see that the empath doesn't spiral, they release. Not in bitterness, but in peace. They pull their energy back, not out of pride, but out of self-respect. That silence, that peace becomes the most powerful shift in the dynamic. The avoidant, who once held emotional power through control and emotional withdrawal, finds themselves disoriented. No more pushing or pulling, no more chase, no more makeup after distance. The old patterns have crumbled, and in the space that opens up something new is possible not manipulation, but reflection. The avoidant might panic at first, but if they have the courage, this is where real growth begins. Because for the first time, no one is playing the old role, and in that, a new relationship becomes possible. One built not on fear or survival, but on truth and self-awareness. The super empath's serenity isn't coldness, it's a message I chose myself. If you can meet me in honesty, I'm still here. But I won't bargain with my self-worth just to feel close. I won't trade my peace for scraps of connection. This is where the relationship either transforms or ends, not in chaos, but in clarity. Because while the super empath may have let go, they didn't let go of love. They let go of the pattern that diminished them. They're not looking to win a tug of war, they're looking to stand in truth. And sometimes that means walking away, not because they've stopped loving, but because they've grown. When you know who you are, when you walk with awareness and self-respect, you can't stay in spaces that shrink you. You no longer feel the need to heal anyone. You become the space first for yourself and then for others if they are ready. And that's the true gift of awakening, not just freeing the empath from emotional captivity, but offering the avoidant the first true mirror without judgment, but with the invitation to evolve. Whether they take that step or not no longer defines your worth, because in healing, the goal is not to keep someone else, it's to keep yourself. So here you are at the most important realization of all. Your power was never in how others treated you. It has always been in what you chose not to tolerate anymore. A super empath who has awakened doesn't need to be right. They don't need to win a battle of emotions. They only need to stand firmly in truth. And that truth is, you deserve a love that never asks you to abandon yourself. You were not born to be consumed to heal others by bleeding your own emotional life force. You were born to connect, yes, but not at the cost of your own self-worth. Every time you say no to toxicity, you are saying yes to yourself. And that, my friend, is the most powerful move you can ever make. So if you've ever thought your sensitivity was a burden, think again. When combined with awareness and boundaries, it becomes not just a tool for survival, but the compass of your inner strength. When you pause, step back, and choose peace over chaos, you're not just breaking a cycle, you're rewriting the entire definition of love you hold for yourself. You don't need to win against the avoidant. You need to win over the fear of abandonment, of not being enough, of being misunderstood. Once you move through that, you become untouchable. Remember this. The avoidant doesn't fall apart when you get angry. They fall apart when you stop coming back. When you're no longer there to be manipulated. When you walk away, not in hate, but in self-respect. That's the end of one cycle, and the beginning of something new. A life where you lead. If you've made it this far, I know you're ready. And if this video resonated with you, hit that like button, share it, and subscribe to the channel for more content that helps you walk in awareness, power, and peace. Drop a comment below and let me know. What boundary are you setting for yourself today? I'll see you in the next video where we continue the journey back to you.